Hi, I'm Brian. Kettle's on, make yourself a cup of tea. Today I want to talk about She-Ra. No, not that one. This one. That's right, the Netflix reboot series. Now, I'm not going to get into the politics or the agenda of this show because that's not what I want this video to focus on. Instead, this video will focus on my thoughts on the reboot of She-Ra. But first, I want to start by talking about the 80s shows of He-Man and She-Ra. Now, 80s cartoons were a lot different than today's cartoons. For one, both He-Man and She-Ra weren't actually allowed to show on-screen violence. Secondly, cartoons of the 80s were mainly just adverts to toy lines. The He-Man cartoon was made to sell the He-Man toy line, and the She-Ra cartoon was created to make a toy line for girls, and as such, when the toys didn't sell as well, the cartoons were cancelled. She-Ra would lay dormant for many years, with fans watching repeats of the cartoons when they aired on TV, or on VHS and on DVD when they were released. Unlike He-Man, who has had two previous reboots, there was a terrible 90s cartoon, which even as a child I couldn't watch because of how bad it was. The other being the early 2000s reboot, which was a brilliant cartoon, but only lasted 2 seasons. And in my opinion, the reason why the 2000s reboot worked and the 90s reboot didn't is because the 90s cartoon tried to change things too much. It set itself years into the future and on a different planet than the 80s show. It was very different and very unfamiliar show. And so onto the reboot of She-Ra. I had heard a lot of negative things about this show. I had also heard some positive things, but not many. The negative outweighed the positive by a lot. So when one of my daughters asked to watch it, I wasn't sure what to fully expect. The only real thing I knew about the show beforehand was it had a very different animation style, which after 30 years from the original She-Ra was to be expected. But unlike the 2000 reboot of He-Man, which kept the muscular look of the 80s version, this new She-Ra completely changed the animation style to what reminded me a lot of the Steven Universe style, which for me, while it suited a new and original show like Steven Universe, it didn't suit the style of the show like She-Ra. The other thing I knew about the show was gone were the grown-up characters that I knew, and in their place what appeared to be kids about 12 or 13. Their age is never specified in the show, but they do look like they're about 12 or 13, rather than the adults they were in the original She-Ra. So with these two negative opinions, and the overwhelming negative things I'd heard of the show, my hopes of being good went overly high. And so, we put on Netflix and watched the first episode. My daughters both really enjoyed it from the start, but I wasn't convinced. I still had the image of the 80s show firmly in my mind, and while I didn't watch an awful lot of She-Ra growing up, I still watched enough of it to have fond memories of it. But, back to the new She-Ra. We continued to watch it and my daughters were both really enjoying it, but my mind was firmly stuck in its nostalgic past, comparing everything between the two versions of the show. And this is how I was going to watch the show, so the memories of a show I fondly remembered from the 80s. Also I thought, because while the show is called She-Ra, has all the main characters and the plot of the 80s show, this version of She-Ra is a different version. And once I realised this, after a couple of episodes, I found myself doing something I wasn't expecting. I was enjoying the show. There were times we'd watch more episodes we'd planned to watch at the time, because we had to find out what was happening in the next episode. It wasn't just my daughters, it was myself included. It didn't take us long to get through all 5 seasons of the show, but at the end of it, all 3 of us were satisfied with the show overall. Now, as I said, these two versions of She-Ra are completely different. The 80s has She-Ra and the Rebellion as fully grown adults. We know this because Adora is Prince Adam's twin sister, and he became He-Man when he was 18. Secondly, the 80s She-Ra, while having a story of the rebellion against the armies of the Horde, was like He-Man, a very standalone episodic show, which many cartoons of the 80s were. Let's not forget, the cartoon was there to sell toys. The new version of the She-Ra has changed from adults in the rebellion to 12-year-olds in the Princess Rebellion. I know it doesn't say if they're 12 or not, but that's how they look. Secondly, the animation style, as I said earlier, isn't for me. Yes, it's a personal opinion, but that's what opinions are. If you don't agree, that's fine, that's your opinion. But when a lot of the characters look like they've used just one body design and they've just changed clothes and hair, it feels like more of an effort could have been made to give everyone their own unique look, instead of a lot of the characters having the same body design, be they male or female. Not all of the characters have the same design, but a lot of them do. Thirdly, Hordak is supposed to be the main villain of the show, but it feels like he's only in the show because he has to be. Omitting Hordak from She-Ra is like taking Skeletor out of He-Man. It wouldn't work. But in this show, it feels like Catra is the biggest threat to She-Ra and the Princess Rebellion than Hordak. Hordak just feels redundant. Finally, this show has more of a sense of story. Yes, it's the same basic premise. Adora realises the Horde are evil and decides to help the rebellion fight them. But this show carries on a plot in a more structured way than the original did. This show has a storyline for each season which is played out and adds to the overall narrative of the show. until Horde Prime is defeated and Etheria is free. Now, I'm not saying it's a great story it tells, but for the show that it is, the story fits it just fine, and does a good job in keeping the viewers entertained. Now, I realise I've not mentioned how the creators of the show have changed things and made some of the characters homosexual. Well, that's because it didn't bother me. Would it have made a difference if they hadn't done that? No, it would have been the same. Changing characters' sexuality alters nothing in my opinion. The biggest complaint I have of the show is them taking away Bo's moustache. And if that's the biggest fault I can find with the show, then the show can't have been that bad. Is it better than the 80s She-Ra? No. 80s She-Ra is still the original and still the better one of the two shows. But this new She-Ra has enough of its own personality to be a different She-Ra. And if you can stop comparing the two shows and watch the new one for what it is, which is a completely new, different take on the story, which I do think would have been a better show if it had been an original idea instead of reusing the She-Ra name, then like me, you may be pleasantly surprised and find you enjoy it. That's all from me. I'm off to make a fresh cup of tea.